people got very excited when it started to go up with stubble retention. You're just getting the breakdown of stubble, the breakdown of plant roots, and you're getting some organic matter formed near the surface of the soil. It tended to stratify a fair bit. In other words, just be like in a thin layer near the surface, and there wasn't much intermixing or much communication going on between those top layers of soil, and there certainly wasn't anything happening down at 20, 30, 40 centimetres or a metre. So we're still running into what we call subsoil constraints in farmed land where we've got zero-till agriculture, because we haven't actually got that whole dynamic living ecosystem going again in those soils. So that the question about what was the question about land management is that the assumption has been that if you got more organic matter in there, you would actually permanently build carbon, and that's where we went off on the wrong track. Because what we didn't realise was that it was the microorganisms living with the plants were the things that we had to have in soil for the humification process to proceed. Actually requires microbial activity. So just to give an example, I know some people have heard this story before, but in 1620, a Dutch fellow grew a tree in a large pot of soil. So he had a great big, like a planter pot full of soil, planted a seed, grew a tree, and then when he harvested that tree, it weighed 169 pounds. And when he weighed the soil, the weight of the soil had only changed by a couple of ounces. And it took scientists 200 years to work out where that tree came from if it didn't come from the soil. So all of the wood that was in that tree, 99% of it didn't come from that soil. So where did that wood come from, that solid form of carbon, if it didn't come from the soil? Where did that tree actually come from, or the wood in that tree? Okay, so it came from the air, and how did the air get turned into a tree? Okay, so through photosynthesis we had carbon dioxide and light energy. So the energy, the light energy, was changed into biochemical energy. In other words, got changed into a chemical compound, which in that case is glucose, so that stores that energy, which then basically runs this planet. Because plant changes it into other carbon compounds, the glucose gets transformed to other carbon compounds. We either eat those plants like lettuces, or if they grow wheat, we eat the grain, or animals eat those plants like pasture plants, and then we eat the meat. So whichever way it works, we're at the end of that food chain that starts with glucose, which is, photosynthesis is an amazing process, turning light energy and carbon dioxide into glucose. And that's how wood's formed. The carbon that we want to build in soil is formed in a very, very similar way. If you don't have green leaves there, you can't fix it in the first place. So the first step to building topsoil is to have green leaves, to fix carbon, which is a gas, and turn it into something. In this case, it's a liquid. It's soluble carbon in the form of glucose, which means it can run around the plant. The plant can change it into other things. What happens in a perennial grassland that's in a healthy condition is that we have a fungus called mycorrhizal fungi living in association with those plant roots. And as I mentioned this afternoon, 60% of the carbon fixed in the leaves can be siphoned off by those mycorrhizal fungi. And you would think it's actually a parasite that lives on the roots of plants, but it's a symbiotic relationship. And even though it's taking a huge amount of the energy fixed by those green leaves, the plants grow 10 to 20% more. And the reason that they do is because in return for that carbon, the fungi bring phosphorus and zinc and water back to the plants. That's why we call it a symbiotic relationship. So the big thing that we see lacking in a lot of Queensland soils, and the reason lots of times that plants don't do well, is because phosphorus or zinc and or both in combination. So both of those are very commonly used in fertilisers. And it's because we've lost the mycorrhizal fungi in the system that can do that naturally for plants in exchange for that carbon. So that the carbon is a gas, it's fixed as a liquid, it moves through the plant in the sap in a liquid form, in the same way as it moves around a tree in the sap in a liquid form. And the tree metabolises it, or whatever the right word for it is, polymerises it into a much more complicated compound. It goes through the lignification process, and it becomes increasingly more and more complex forms of carbon until it ends up being wood in a tree. In the soil, it's going to get siphoned off from the roots out into the hyphae. A hyphae is just a tube, just like a strand of hair. It's just a hollow tube, and in this case it's going to be full of this soluble carbon that's been siphoned off out of the roots. They only live for about 10 or 12 days in the soil. They're turning over all the time. And as those hyphae full of liquid carbon die in the soil, they're consumed by other microorganisms that process them, and very quickly it goes through the soil food web and is turned into humus. Humus is a large, very complex polymer meaning it's a combination of all sorts of things, that the whole humification process is a polymerisation process. It's a part of the soil matrix. You cannot extract humus from soil. It's not possible, and that's one of the things that makes it very difficult to study in a laboratory. You can measure how much you have, you can measure how much carbon is in there, but you can't physically take the humus out because it's an integral part of the soil matrix. Once you've taken it away from the soil, well, it's not possible anyway, because it's all joined to the soil minerals, and it's very important for soil structure and very important for water holding capacity, because it can hold somewhere between 20 times, between 4 times and 20 times its own weight in water. And it's a gel-like substance that some people have sort of described it as being something like crude oil. Okay, so it doesn't look anything like compost, doesn't look like that crumbly black stuff that you get when organic matter breaks down. So in a zero-till system, you'd have your lines of stubble that have been left from last year's crop. You'd have the crowns breaking down, the roots breaking down, and underneath those plants you'd find lots of lovely crumbly black stuff, and that's not humus. And that goes back to the atmosphere within 12 to 18 months. So when our top scientists say, well, we've studied soil carbon, Christine, and we can tell you the carbon doesn't stay there, I say, well, you're looking at the wrong kind of carbon, okay? Because you're not looking at a living ecosystem where you've got all of those microbes, and as I said before, 95% of diversity is in soil. We know so little about those associations and how those microbes work for us, and how we have to maintain their habitat by providing an energy source and ground cover and things that they need, and also to stop doing the things that will kill them, like using herbicides and pesticides. Anyway, I'm going to run out of time.
Compost, is that a waste of time?
No, it's not a waste of time because labile carbon is very, very good for soil. It's just that compost will eventually go back to be carbon dioxide, most of it. But it's, you know, great for holding moisture and great for feeding all the bugs in soil. I mean, any kind of carbon is going to be, or most kinds of carbon are going to be really good for soil. But if we're talking about getting carbon credits for permanent soil, it's probably a slightly different thing to doing good things for the soil. I mean, you would want a certain percentage of your carbon to be in that form. But if you were to make compost tea from it, or strip it and get some humic compounds out of it, they will have a protective effect on the liquid carbon that comes out of plant roots. So by applying compost products, you can protect the carbon and improve the humification process.